Imagine the most powerful superhero team on the planet, a group of gods walking among men, a team that has stopped alien invasions, reversed the rotation of the Earth and stared down the face of cosmic annihilation without blinking. And now imagine that every single one of them, every cape, every power ring, every magical lasso, every Kryptonian fist, means absolutely nothing. Not because a villain finally figured out how to beat them. Not because some ancient prophecy came true. Not because the multiverse collapsed or a new dark god rose from the shadows of creation. But because one completely average-looking bald man in a yellow jumpsuit showed up, looked at the most powerful beings on Earth with the most profoundly bored expression you have ever seen in your life, and simply refused to be impressed by any of it. That is not a joke. That is not an exaggeration. That is exactly what happens when Saitama walks into the DC universe, and today we are going to explore every single second of it. From the moment he arrives to the moment the Justice League realizes that everything they believed about power, strength, and what it means to be a hero has been quietly, completely, and irreversibly shattered by a man who just wanted a good fight. Before we get into this, if you are the kind of person who loves watching overpowered characters walk into situations they were never meant to survive and then casually ruin everyone's day, you are in the right place. Hit that subscribe button right now because we do this every single week, and trust me, you do not want to miss what is coming next. Drop a comment below telling me who you think lasts the longest against Saitama, because the answers are going to surprise you. And stick around until the very end of this video, because Part 6 has something that nobody ever talks about when it comes to Saitama crossovers, and it might genuinely change the way you think about his character entirely. It starts the way these things always start in the DC universe, with something falling from the sky. Metropolis has seen this before, of course. The people of this city have watched Superman punch robots the size of skyscrapers. They have seen Darkseid's forces rain down from orbit. They have witnessed the kind of destruction that would make most civilizations simply give up and move somewhere quieter. And yet somehow, impossibly, Metropolis always rebuilds, always recovers. Always looks up at the sky with that particular brand of stubborn optimism that seems to be written into the DNA of every person who chooses to live under the shadow of the daily planet globe. So when something tears through the upper atmosphere on a Tuesday afternoon, leaving a trail of superheated air and a sonic boom that rattles windows from downtown all the way to the harbor, people do not panic. They look up. They shield their eyes from the sun. They wait. What lands in Centennial Park is not a missile, not an alien craft, not a chunk of kryptonite the size of a school bus. It is a man. A very short, very ordinary-looking man in a white cape and a yellow jumpsuit, who hits the ground with enough force to send a shockwave rolling outward in every direction, cratering the earth beneath him into a perfect circular depression about 40 feet across, vaporizing the fountain at the center of the park, and sending every pigeon within a quarter mile into a panicked, confused spiral. And then he stands up, brushes some dirt off his sleeve, looks around at the smoking crater he has just created entirely by accident simply by arriving, and says, with complete and total sincerity, that he hopes he did not land on anything important. His name is Saitama, and he has no idea where he is. This is the thing that the Justice League's emergency response system, which is admittedly one of the most sophisticated early warning networks ever constructed by human or superhuman hands, completely fails to account for in those first critical minutes. The system is designed to detect threats. It scans for energy signatures, weapon systems, hostile intent, known villain biometrics, and about 300 other categories of danger that Batman has spent years programming into the Watchtower's mainframe. What it is not designed to detect is a man who registers as an unclassified anomaly, because his power output is so far outside any known scale that the sensors simply do not have a category for it. The computers look at Saitama and they see a human being. They see normal bone density, normal muscle mass, normal cardiovascular readings, a completely standard biological profile that should belong to someone who works a desk job and maybe goes to the gym twice a week. And then they look at the crater he just made and they see an impact force that should not be physically possible from anything short of a small meteorite. And the two pieces of information simply refuse to reconcile with each other. So the system flags him as a sensor error and moves on. Superman gets there first. This is not a surprise. Clark Kent had been in the middle of an interview on the 42nd floor of a Metropolis office building when the shockwave hit, and by the time the dust settled he was already in the air, cape streaming behind him, blue eyes scanning the park below with vision that can see through walls, read the temperature of a match flame from 3 miles away, and count the individual cells in a blade of grass. He lands about 20 feet from Saitama, because Superman always leaves a little space, always gives whoever he is approaching the chance to explain themselves before he escalates anything. And he crosses his arms in that particular way he has that manages to communicate both absolute authority and genuine willingness to listen. And he asks, politely but very clearly, who this person is and what they want. Saitama looks at him. And this is the moment, this is the very first moment where things begin to go subtly, quietly, irrevocably wrong, because Saitama's expression does not change. There is no awe. There is no recognition of the symbol on his chest, which is arguably one of the most recognizable symbols in the history of human civilization. There is no fear, no aggression, no calculation, none of the things Superman has learned over decades of doing this job to read in a person's face in the first 3 seconds of an encounter. There is just a faint, distant look of mild curiosity, the kind of expression you might make when you see an interesting cloud formation. And then Saitama asks Superman if he knows where the nearest convenience store is because he is pretty sure he forgot to eat breakfast before whatever dimensional anomaly dropped him here. Superman blinks. This is not a common occurrence. He tells Saitama, still politely, still with that careful measured authority, that he is going to need to come with him for a few questions. And Saitama shrugs and says sure, whatever, he has nothing else going on. And so the Man of Steel and the One-Punch Man walk side by side out of the smoking remains of Centennial Park Fountain, and neither of them fully understands yet what kind of story they have just walked into. But the universe does, and somewhere deep in the infrastructure of the Watchtower's sensor array, a file marked unclassified anomaly quietly begins to grow. The Watchtower sits in geosynchronous orbit above the Earth, a structure that represents the combined engineering genius of Batman, the technological resources of multiple alien civilizations, and about 4 years of construction arguments between Green Lantern and Cyborg about the most efficient way to route power through the station's secondary grid. It is, by any reasonable measure, the most sophisticated facility ever built in Earth's orbit, and it is absolutely not prepared for Saitama. Not because of anything dramatic, not because alarms start blaring or systems start failing, but because Saitama sits down in one of the chairs in the main conference room, looks around at the panoramic view of the Earth below them, says that is pretty cool, and then asks if anyone has any cup noodles. Batman is watching through a security feed from 3 different angles. He has been watching since the moment the anomaly was flagged, because Batman watches everything, and he has already run 17 different threat assessment models on Saitama in the time it took Superman to fly him up to the station. All 17 models have returned the same result, which is that the data is insufficient and contradictory, and that further observation is required. Batman does not like results like that. Results like that mean that something is operating outside the parameters he has built his entire strategic framework around, and things that operate outside his parameters have a historical tendency to become very serious problems very quickly. He walks into the conference room and he looks at Saitama sitting in the chair, and he says nothing for about 15 seconds, which is a very long time to say nothing when you are Batman. And Saitama looks back at him and says the cape is cool, but the ears seem impractical. Batman continues to say nothing. Wonder Woman arrives a moment later, followed by Flash, who has already lapped the station twice just to run a few informal readings on their guest, and Green Lantern, who is holding a construct shaped like a scanner because Hal Jordan's first response to anything unfamiliar is to point something at it. Cyborg is already pulling up every database he has access to, running Saitama's face through criminal records, missing persons files, interdimensional traveler registries, everything, and finding nothing except a vague reference in a file that seems to originate from a universe that should not technically be accessible from this one. A file that contains only 3 words before it cuts off in what looks like a catastrophic data compression error. The 3 words are, "Do not engage." Nobody notices that file for another 47 minutes, and by then, things have already started. It starts with Flash. It starts with Flash because it always starts with Flash, and anyone who has spent more than 15 minutes around Barry Allen could have told you that the moment he walked into that conference room and saw a completely ordinary-looking man sitting in a chair acting like he was waiting for a bus, his entire personality was going to demand that he do something about it. Flash is not reckless, not exactly, but he operates on a fundamental belief that speed solves most problems, that if you can move fast enough you can outrun danger, outrun confusion, outrun the uncomfortable feeling that something in the room is not what it appears to be. And so he does what he always does when he is uncertain about something, which is move faster than the uncertainty can keep up with. He tells Saitama, very casually, very conversationally, that he is going to run a quick test. Nothing serious, just a little reaction time check. Standard stuff they do with anyone new who comes through the station. And before he finishes the sentence, he is already moving. Already a red and gold blur circling the conference table at a speed that turns the air into a low, continuous hum. And he reaches out to tap Saitama on the shoulder from behind at roughly 800 miles per hour. Which is the kind of speed that should be completely invisible to any human nervous system ever recorded. Saitama turns around and looks at him before his hand makes contact. Not after, not at the same moment. Before, he turns around with the same mild, faintly curious expression he has been wearing since he landed in Centennial Park, and he looks at Flash's outstretched hand and then up at Flash's face. And the silence that follows is the specific kind of silence that happens when an entire room full of extraordinarily powerful people all have the same thought at exactly the same time and nobody wants to be the first one to say it out loud. Flash stops moving. He is standing completely still now, which for Barry Allen is its own kind of statement, because Barry Allen is almost never completely still. His nervous system does not really allow for it. But right now he is standing with his hands still extended, and his eyes wide behind his cowl, and he is looking at Saitama with an expression that his friends would later describe, if asked, as the closest thing to genuine confusion they had ever seen on his face. He tells Saitama that was impressive. He says it quietly. Saitama shrugs and says he has pretty good reflexes, which is such a profound understatement that Wonder Woman, who has been standing near the door with her arms crossed and the careful, measured expression of someone who has seen many strange things and learned to reserve judgment until she has more information, allows herself one very small, very controlled blink of surprise. Superman has been watching all of this from the far end of the table, and he has been doing what Clark Kent always does when something does not add up, which is file it carefully and keep his expression neutral and wait for more data. But there is something else happening underneath that patience, something that does not have a lot of room to exist inside someone like Superman, which is the very faint, very uncomfortable beginning of a feeling he almost never has to deal with. It is not quite worry. It is not quite alarm. It is something closer to the feeling you get when you are doing a puzzle and you reach for a piece that should fit and it does not, and you hold it up and look at it and realize that the piece is not wrong, that it fits perfectly. But the picture it creates when it clicks into place is not the picture you were expecting. Superman is very good at being the strongest person in the room. He has built an entire identity, an entire way of moving through the world, around the understanding that when things get bad enough, when the situation escalates far enough, he is the one who can always do more, always push further, always be the last line between whatever is coming and the people he has sworn to protect. It is not arrogance. Clark Kent is genuinely not an arrogant person. But it is a certainty, and certainties are very difficult to let go of once you have been holding them for 30 years. He tells the team he wants to run one more assessment, and he looks at Saitama when he says it. And Saitama looks back at him and says, "Sure, whatever you need." And there is something in the way he says it, something in the complete absence of either eagerness or nervousness, that should probably be a warning sign. But Superman is already standing up, already moving toward the center of the room, already in that particular stance he takes when he is about to demonstrate exactly what he is capable of. Shoulders back, hands loose at his sides, the full weight of the symbol on his chest suddenly feeling very present. He tells Saitama he is going to need him to stand over there, pointing to an open section of floor near the observation window, and he tells him not to worry, that this is just to get a baseline reading, and Saitama walks over and stands where he is told with his hands in his pockets, and his expression suggesting that he is thinking about something else entirely, possibly what he wants for lunch. And Superman crosses the room in less than a second and throws a punch. Not a full punch. He is very clear about that later in the debrief, in every conversation he has about this moment for a very long time afterward. It was not a full punch. He pulled it, held back somewhere between 90 and 95% of his actual output, because he was doing an assessment, not an execution, because there are protocols, because he is Superman and Superman does not just haul off and hit people at full power in the middle of the Watchtower conference room. He pulled it. He is absolutely certain of that. And the punch he threw was still, conservatively, enough force to level a city block, enough kinetic energy to register on seismic monitors 3 states away, the kind of impact that would have sent anyone else in that room, any one of the extraordinary, nearly indestructible people standing around that table, sliding back through the wall and out into the vacuum of space. Saitama catches it. He does not dodge. He does not sidestep. He does not generate a force field or create a construct or call on any magical protection. He takes his right hand out of his pocket and he holds it up, and he catches Superman's fist in his palm the way you might catch a ball that someone tossed to you underhand. And the shockwave from the impact blows every piece of loose equipment off the conference table and cracks the observation window behind him in a delta pattern that spreads from floor to ceiling. And Saitama looks at his own hand for a moment. And then he looks at Superman, and he says, "You are pretty strong." In the tone of voice a person uses when they are genuinely, mildly pleased to have found something slightly more interesting than they expected. The room is completely silent. Superman is still in his follow-through position, his fist inside Saitama's palm, and he is staring at this man, this completely ordinary-looking man in a yellow jumpsuit who caught his punch like it was a minor inconvenience. And the certainty he has been carrying for 30 years is doing something in his chest that he does not have a clean word for. Batman is already moving, already pulling up new data on his gauntlet, already 3 steps ahead in the strategic calculation, because this is what Batman does. This is how he processes impossible information, by immediately beginning to plan around it, but even Batman's hands have slowed down slightly, and his eyes are moving between his display and Saitama with a frequency that suggests he is recalculating something fundamental. Wonder Woman has uncrossed her arms. Flash has not moved since Saitama turned around before he could tap him, and he is still standing in the same spot, still with that wide-eyed expression. But now there is something else in it, something that on anyone else you might call awe, except that Barry Allen does not awe easily, and the fact that he is doing it now says more than anything else in the room. Saitama lets go of Superman's fist and steps back and rolls his neck to one side, and he says, in the most genuinely conversational tone imaginable, that it has been a while since someone hit him with something that he actually felt a little bit, which is the kind of sentence that lands in the middle of that silent room like a stone dropped into still water, the ripples spreading outward and touching everything. Superman straightens up. He looks at his own hand. He looks at Saitama. And for the first time in a very long time, Clark Kent does not know what to say. It is Green Lantern who speaks first, which is perhaps appropriate because Hal Jordan has always had a talent for naming the thing that everyone else is dancing around. He says, very quietly but very clearly, that they might have a problem, and nobody in the room disagrees. Not even Batman, which is its own kind of extraordinary event, because Batman always has a counterargument. Batman's entire methodology is built on the premise that there is always an angle you have not considered, always a variable you can isolate, always a way to turn any situation back into something manageable. But right now Batman is looking at the data on his gauntlet, and the data on his gauntlet is telling him the same thing it has been telling him since Saitama landed in Centennial Park, which is that the numbers do not work, that every measurement they have taken is simultaneously completely mundane and completely impossible, and that the file his system flagged 47 minutes ago that said "do not engage" is starting to feel less like a data error and more like a very earnest piece of advice from someone who had already been through exactly this moment. Superman pulls him aside. Not dramatically, not in a way that Saitama would necessarily notice, but he puts a hand on Batman's shoulder and steers him 2 steps toward the corridor, and he says quietly, "What are we dealing with?" And Batman looks at him for a long moment, and he says the honest thing, the thing he almost never says, the 3 words that cost him more than almost anything else in his vocabulary. He says he does not know. And Superman nods very slowly and looks back through the doorway at Saitama, who has found a chair again and is now apparently trying to fold a piece of paper into something, his brow furrowed in the concentration of a man who is deeply invested in a completely trivial task, entirely unbothered, entirely comfortable, entirely unconcerned with the fact that he just caught a Superman punch and changed every calculation in the room. And Clark Kent stands in the doorway and watches him and understands, with the kind of clarity that only comes after a certainty breaks, that whatever comes next, it is not going to look like anything he has planned for. Bruce Wayne has a plan for everything. This is not hyperbole, and it is not legend. It is simply a fact about the man that everyone who has ever worked with him understands within about the first week of doing so, the same way you understand that the sun rises in the east and that Gotham City smells like rain and old stone in October. He has contingency files for alien invasions, for magical catastrophes, for rogue Kryptonians, for the possibility that any one of his teammates might someday need to be neutralized for the safety of everyone else. Files that he keeps encrypted on a private server that even Cyborg has never fully cracked. Files that represent years of careful, paranoid, meticulous thinking about every possible failure mode of every possible situation he has ever encountered or imagined. He has a plan called Fenrir for if Superman goes rogue. He has a plan called Tartarus for if Wonder Woman loses herself in battle. He has 17 different contingencies for Flash, because Flash is fast and fast things are difficult to plan around, and you always want more options when your margin for error is measured in milliseconds. He has plans for gods, for monsters, for things that came from the edges of the universe with names that sound like the universe trying to describe its own nightmares. He does not have a plan for Saitama. This is the thing that sits underneath everything Batman does in the next 3 hours. The thing that drives every calculation, every test, every carefully constructed scenario he runs in his head while watching Saitama sit in that chair and fold paper, and occasionally look out the observation window at the earth below with an expression of mild appreciation. The way a tourist might look at a moderately famous landmark they had not expected to find particularly interesting, but turned out to be somewhat worth the trip. Bruce Wayne's entire methodology, the entire architecture of how he moves through the world and solves problems and keeps people safe, rests on the premise that everything can be understood if you gather enough data and think carefully enough about what it means. He has built a life on that premise. He has saved cities on that premise. He has looked at the impossible and found the pattern underneath it, and turned the impossible into something he could work with, plan around, ultimately control. And he has done it so many times, in so many impossible situations, that the certainty of it has become something close to identity, close to the thing that makes Bruce Wayne, rather than just a very smart man in an expensive suit standing in the dark. But the data on Saitama does not resolve into a pattern. It does not simplify. The more tests Batman runs, the more readings he takes, the more variables he isolates and examines, the more the numbers refuse to do what numbers are supposed to do, which is tell you something true and workable about the thing you are measuring. Saitama's physical readings are human. His biological profile is the profile of a healthy adult male in his mid to late 20s, with slightly above average muscle development and no detectable enhancements, no Kryptonian DNA markers, no Green Lantern energy signature, no magical resonance, no connection to the speed force or the emotional spectrum or any other known source of extraordinary power. He is, by every instrument Batman possesses, a completely ordinary person. And yet he caught Superman's punch. And yet he turned around before Flash could touch him. And yet the crater he made landing in Centennial Park was not the crater of a man who weighs perhaps 70 kilograms falling from a great height. It was the crater of something that should not have a biological profile at all. Batman spends 40 minutes in the auxiliary analysis room running the same readings through different filters, different calibration settings, different theoretical frameworks, looking for the variable he missed, the measurement that was corrupted, the sensor that malfunctioned at the critical moment, because there has to be an explanation that fits inside a framework he understands. There has to be a mechanism he can identify and isolate and ultimately find a way to address. He finds nothing. The readings are clean. The sensors are calibrated correctly. The data is internally consistent and externally impossible, and Bruce Wayne stands in the auxiliary analysis room and lets himself have exactly 30 seconds of something that in anyone else you would call frustration, and then he puts it away, because 30 seconds is all he allows, and he walks back into the corridor with a plan. It is not a good plan. He knows it is not a good plan even as he is constructing it, because a good plan is built on understanding and he does not have understanding. He has only observation, and observation without understanding is just watching things happen to you. But it is a plan, and a plan is better than no plan, and Bruce Wayne has never in his life walked into a room without a plan, not even this room, not even now, and he is not going to start. He goes back to the conference room and he sits down across from Saitama, and he puts his hands flat on the table, and he says he wants to talk. Saitama looks up from his paper folding, which has at this point produced something that might be a crane or might be a very abstract interpretation of a boat, and he says sure. And there is a quality to the way he says it, a complete and genuine openness that Batman had not quite expected, and that changes the texture of the conversation before it even begins. Because Batman is very good at reading people, and what he reads in Saitama right now is not deception, and not strategy, and not the careful performance of harmlessness that genuinely dangerous people sometimes adopt. It is just a man who has nowhere else to be and no particular objection to talking. Batman asks him where he came from. Saitama explains, in the vague and slightly unfocused way of someone recounting a story that does not particularly interest them, that there was some kind of monster that could apparently open dimensional rifts, a new type he had not seen before, and he had punched it, which had caused the rift to destabilize and pull him through before it closed, and he had ended up here, and he is not particularly worried about getting back because these things usually sort themselves out. Batman asks him what kind of monster. Saitama thinks about it for a moment and says it was pretty big, maybe dragon level, probably higher, and it had a lot of mouths. Batman asks him what dragon level means, and Saitama, explains the hero association threat classification system in about 4 sentences, and Batman listens to this explanation with the particular quality of attention he reserves for information that is reorganizing his existing understanding of something important. Because what Saitama is describing is a world where the threats are so numerous and so severe that they have developed an entire bureaucratic infrastructure around categorizing and responding to them. A world where monsters capable of destroying cities are common enough to require a standardized rating system, and where a man who can catch Superman's punch describes himself as a professional hero who does it for fun, or at least used to, before the fun went out of it. That last part stops Batman. He asks Saitama to repeat it, and Saitama shrugs and says that the problem with being as strong as he is that nothing is a challenge anymore, that every fight ends the same way, with one punch. And after a while the fights stop feeling like fights and start feeling like chores. And he had become a hero because he wanted the thrill of a real battle, a real opponent, something that would push him. Something that would make him feel something other than the specific kind of empty that comes from being so far beyond everything that nothing can reach you anymore. And he had trained so hard and become so strong that he had punched the feeling right out of himself along with every other limitation. And now here he is, the strongest thing in whatever room he is standing in, and he is bored. He says it the way you say the weather is bad, flatly and without drama, as a simple statement of fact about the current conditions of his existence. Batman is quiet for a long moment. He is thinking about something that has nothing to do with threat assessment models or contingency files, or the 17 different ways he has considered neutralizing a threat he cannot measure. He is thinking about a man who wanted something so badly that he sacrificed everything to get it, and then discovered that getting it had made it impossible to want anything at all. And he is thinking about how that is a particular kind of tragedy that does not have a tactical solution. And he is thinking, very quietly and very privately, that he understands something about that feeling. The specific exhaustion of a man who has made himself into a weapon, so complete and so efficient that he has left no room inside himself for anything the weapon cannot use. He does not say any of this. He is Batman, and Batman does not say things like that in a first conversation, or possibly ever, but he thinks it, and it changes the angle of everything that follows. He tells Saitama that he would like to propose something, and Saitama waits, and Batman says that before they figure out how to get him home, he thinks it would be useful for everyone involved to understand the full extent of what Saitama can do, not for aggressive purposes, not as a threat assessment, but because Batman does not like operating without complete information, and he thinks Saitama deserves to be around people who actually understand what they are dealing with rather than people who are quietly recalibrating their entire worldview every time he does something ordinary. Saitama looks at him for a moment and then says that is a pretty honest thing to say, and Batman says he tries when it is strategically appropriate, and Saitama almost smiles just barely, just at the corner of his mouth, and he says, "Okay, sure, what did you have in mind?" What Batman has in mind is controlled, structured, carefully designed to extract maximum information while minimizing collateral damage and keeping every variable within manageable parameters. He has allocated a training facility on the station's lower level, reinforced walls, energy dampening systems, 6 different recording arrays, and he has quietly asked Superman to be present, not to intervene, not to escalate, just to be there as a baseline reference, because Superman is the strongest measurement he has, and he needs a measurement he trusts. It is a good plan as plans go, given that it is built on almost no understanding of what it is planning around. It lasts approximately 4 minutes before everything Batman thought he had controlled stops being controlled, and the thing he has been carefully not calling fear since Saitama landed in Centennial Park starts to feel a great deal more like the right word for it. The training facility on the Watchtower's lower level is a room that has seen extraordinary things. It was built to handle the kind of training sessions that happen when your roster includes a Kryptonian, an Amazonian warrior, a man who can generate any construct imaginable from pure willpower, and a speedster who can accidentally break the sound barrier just by stretching before a workout. The walls are reinforced with promethium plating, layered over a vibranium composite that Batman sourced from 3 different continents and 2 off-world contacts. And the energy-dampening systems running through the floor and ceiling are calibrated to absorb and redistribute impact, forces up to a theoretical maximum that the engineers who built them described as effectively limitless. Which is the kind of phrase that sounds reassuring right up until the moment you discover what effectively limitless actually means when you stop treating it as a ceiling and start treating it as a challenge. The room has survived training sessions with Superman at 80% output. It has survived Wonder Woman working through combat drills with her full strength and no restraint. It has survived, just barely and with significant repair costs afterward, a session where Green Lantern and Flash decided to test what happened if you combined a solid light, construct the size of a freight train with Flash running at full speed inside it, which Batman had not authorized and had expressed his feelings about very clearly and at considerable length afterward. None of that prepared it for what happens when Saitama does a warm-up stretch. He does not even mean to do anything. That is the part that Batman keeps coming back to in the debrief, the part that refuses to sit comfortably in any of his analytical frameworks, because a threat you can quantify is a threat you can address, and what Saitama is doing is not threatening, it is not aggressive, it is not even particularly dramatic. He walks into the room and he rolls his shoulders back and he shakes out his arms the way an athlete might before a casual jog, not before a fight, not before anything that requires serious physical output, just a light loosening of the joints, the kind of movement that belongs in a park on a Sunday morning, and the pressure wave that rolls outward from that movement, from the simple act of his muscles engaging at their resting state. Hits the promethium walls with enough force to register on the Watchtower's external seismic sensors, which are designed to detect asteroid impacts, not the morning stretches of a man who is not even paying close attention to what he is doing. Superman feels it in his back teeth. He is standing near the observation panel on the far side of the room, and the pressure wave washes over him and he feels it, actually feels it. A sensation so unfamiliar that for a moment he cannot identify it because he has not felt the casual output of something stronger than him pushing against his body, since he was a child in Smallville still learning what his own strength meant. And the identification of that sensation takes about 2 full seconds longer than it should because his brain keeps offering him alternative explanations, and he keeps having to reject them one by one, until the only one left is the correct one. He straightens up and he looks at Saitama, and Saitama is looking at his own hands with mild interest, turning them over, flexing his fingers, apparently thinking about something, and Superman thinks, very quietly and with great care, that this is going to be a very different kind of morning than he planned for. Batman is watching from the observation booth above the facility, and he is already on the comm to the rest of the League, because the reading that just came through the seismic sensors has changed his assessment significantly, and significantly is doing a great deal of work in that sentence. He tells them all, tells Diana and Hal and Barry and Cyborg and Aquaman, who had arrived at the station 20 minutes ago after picking up the comm traffic and deciding, in the way Arthur Curry decides most things, that he would rather be present for whatever this is than hear about it afterward. He tells them all that he wants everyone in the observation booth in the next 90 seconds, and that this is not a drill, and that he needs their full attention, because what he is about to show them is going to require everyone in the room to update their priors about several things they currently believe to be true. They watch. What happens next is not a fight. Batman is very clear about that. Then and later and every time the subject comes up for as long as it remains a subject that comes up. It is an assessment. It is a structured, carefully monitored series of graduated tests designed to establish parameters, and it proceeds in exactly the orderly, controlled manner Batman designed it to proceed in right up until the moment it stops doing that, which is approximately when Saitama, responding to Superman's request to show what he can do at a low output level, taps the Prometheum wall with 2 fingers. The wall does not crack. Cracking would have been manageable. Cracking is a thing that happens to walls that are being tested near their limits, and it means the system is working as intended, absorbing and redistributing force, doing what it was built to do. The wall does not crack. What the wall does is simply stop being a wall in that location. A circular section of Prometheum composite about 6 feet in diameter pressing outward like a bubble in metal, and then separating cleanly from the surrounding surface, and drifting into the space beyond the outer hull, tumbling slowly away into orbit, and the explosive decompression that follows is immediate and total, and it is only because Superman is already moving, already throwing himself across the room and pressing his body against the breach, before the pressure differential can do what pressure differentials do to anyone standing in a room that has just opened to the vacuum of space, that the situation does not become a great deal worse in the next 4 seconds. He holds the breach closed with his body, and he looks over his shoulder at Saitama, who is standing in the center of the room looking at his 2 fingers with an expression of genuine, unaffected apology, and he says he used about 3% there. He thought that was probably low enough. He is sorry about the wall. Superman, pressed against a gap in the hull of a space station, with the vacuum of space on the other side of his back, says that is fine. It is no problem. They will fix it. And his voice is absolutely steady and controlled, and there is nothing in it that reveals what is happening in the part of him that has been quietly recalibrating since Centennial Park. Nothing that reveals the thing he has been very carefully not saying to anyone, including himself, which is that 3% of what Saitama just demonstrated with 2 fingers on a reinforced wall is still, conservatively, more than Superman himself can generate at full output, which means that the arithmetic of this situation has a conclusion that he keeps doing the math on and getting the same answer and really wishes he could find an error in. In the observation booth, nobody speaks for about 8 seconds. Diana has her arms crossed again, but there is nothing controlled about the expression on her face, nothing of the careful reserve she had brought into the room with her, because Diana of Themyscira has fought gods, has stood on the field of battle against enemies that could reshape reality, has looked at the worst the world and the worlds beyond it could produce and met it without flinching. And she is looking at Saitama through the observation glass with the particular expression of someone who is revising a fundamental assumption and finding that the revision leads somewhere she had not expected to go. Hal Jordan is very quiet. Barry Allen is doing the math in his head, the same math Superman is doing, and arriving at the same conclusion, and his expression suggests that the conclusion is not sitting well in his stomach. Aquaman is looking at his trident, and then at Saitama, and then at his trident again, in a way that suggests he is having private thoughts about the relative usefulness of his trident in this specific situation. Cyborg is running numbers, always running numbers, but his processing speed has slowed slightly, which for Cyborg is the equivalent of anyone else stopping dead in their tracks, because Cyborg's processors slow down when they encounter input that exceeds the parameters of their predictive models. And right now every predictive model he has is running hard and returning nothing but error states. Batman says very quietly that he wants them all to go down there, not to fight, not to escalate. He says he wants them to go down there because he has run out of information he can gather from a distance, and what he needs now is direct interaction. He needs all of them in the room with Saitama at the same time, because he has a theory about what Saitama is, and the theory requires testing, and the only way to test it is to put the full weight of the Justice League in that room and see what happens to the energy readings. See what happens to the sensor data. See if the numbers change when Saitama is surrounded by the collective power of every person on this station. Because Batman's theory, the thing he has been building towards since he read the words "do not engage" in that corrupted file 2 hours ago, is that Saitama's power is not fixed, that it does not have a ceiling in any conventional sense, that it scales in response to what it is measuring itself against. And if that theory is correct, then putting the entire Justice League in a room with him is either the most important thing they can do or the worst idea anyone has had in the history of this station. And the only way to find out which one is to do it. Diana looks at him for a long moment and says that is a terrible plan, and he says yes, and she says she will go first. They file into the room one by one, and Saitama watches them come in with the mild, patient attention of someone watching people take their seats at an event he is not particularly invested in. And he says it is getting a little crowded in here, and Batman says they just want to talk, and Saitama says sure. And then they are all there, all of them. Superman still sealing the breach in the hull with one hand, Wonder Woman and Green Lantern and Flash and Aquaman and Cyborg arranged in a loose arc. The full assembled weight of the Justice League in one room with one man in a yellow jumpsuit. And the sensor readings that Cyborg is pulling in real time are doing exactly what Batman's theory predicted they would do, which is nothing. Which is showing no change whatsoever in Saitama's biological profile or energy signature or any measurable output, because Saitama is not reacting to them the way a power source reacts to a challenge. He is not scaling up. He is not preparing. And for one moment Batman thinks his theory was wrong, and the relief of that is enormous. And then Saitama yawns. A real, genuine, completely unperformed yawn. The yawn of a man who is mildly tired and not particularly stimulated by his current situation. And every energy sensor in the room spikes simultaneously to a reading that maxes every scale they have, and then keeps going past the maximum into a range that the instrument simply cannot display. And the spike lasts exactly as long as the yawn does, and then drops back to baseline as Saitama finishes, and covers his mouth politely and says, "Excuse me." And every person in that room, every extraordinary, powerful, battle-hardened member of the Justice League, feels it in their bones, feels the casual edges of something so vast that they are only perceiving the absolute outermost boundary of it, the way you might feel the pressure change in the air before a storm without ever seeing the storm itself. And the feeling passes as quickly as it came, and Saitama is just a man in a yellow jumpsuit again, sitting on the floor now because there are no chairs left in the room, looking up at all of them with that mild, slightly apologetic expression. Flash says very quietly that he thinks they might need a different approach. And for once, absolutely nobody disagrees with him, not even Batman, who is standing in the observation booth looking at a sensor readout that has just confirmed his theory and made him wish, for the first time in a very long time, that he had been wrong. Diana of Themyscira has died before. This is not a metaphor, and it is not mythology. It is a biographical fact about her life that she carries the way other people carry old injuries, present but not defining, something that happened and changed things, and then became part of the landscape of who she is. She has stood on the shores of worlds that no longer exist and fought battles whose outcomes shape the fate of entire civilizations, and she has lost some of those battles, has felt the weight of defeat in the specific way that only someone who takes fighting seriously ever truly feels it, not as humiliation but as information, as data about the distance between where she is and where she needs to be, and she has always found a way to close that distance. This is the thing that makes Diana who she is, not the strength, not the speed, not the lasso of truth or the gifts of the gods or any of the extraordinary things she was given at birth and earned through decades of training and battle, but the refusal, the deep and entirely unperformative refusal to accept that the distance between where she is and where she needs to be is unclosable, that there is any gap too wide, any enemy too strong, any situation too far gone to fight her way back from. She is thinking about all of this as she walks back into the training facility alone, without telling anyone she is going, without asking Batman's permission or Superman's blessing or anyone's opinion about whether this is a good idea, because Diana does not generally ask permission for things she has already decided to do, and she has already decided to do this. The breach in the hull has been temporarily sealed with a Green Lantern construct while Cyborg coordinates repairs, and the room is empty except for Saitama, who is sitting cross-legged on the floor with his paper crane balanced on his knee, looking out through the observation window at the slow curve of the earth below, and he looks up when she comes in with the unhurried attention of someone who was not expecting company, but does not particularly mind it. She sits down on the floor across from him, not standing, not in a combat stance, not with any of the physical language of authority or challenge that she might bring to a room where she needed to establish something. She sits down on the floor of the training facility in her full armor with her lasso coiled at her hip and her bracers catching the light from the observation window, and she looks at him the way she looks at things. She is genuinely trying to understand, directly, and without the protective distance of analysis, and she asks him if he is lonely. Saitama looks at her for a moment. The question has clearly landed differently than he expected, differently than anything anyone has said to him since he arrived on the station, because everyone else has been asking him about power, about limits, about mechanisms and measurements and what he can do and how much of it and what the ceiling is. And Diana has looked at all of that information and decided to ask about something else entirely. And he sits with the question for a few seconds the way you sit with something that has touched a nerve you were not aware of, carefully, without wanting to move too fast in any direction. He says, yeah, kind of, and his voice has a quality it has not had in any of the previous conversations, something slightly less armored, slightly more like the voice of a person, and less like the voice of a man who has made peace with his situation by not looking at it too closely. He says that the problem with being this strong is not the strength itself, not the winning, not even the boredom, or not only those things, but that it creates a kind of distance between him and everyone else that he does not know how to close, that every person he meets either cannot understand what his life is like because the experience of it is so far outside normal human reference that it simply does not translate, or they are afraid of him, not in an obvious way, not usually, but in the small, constant way that people are afraid of things they cannot measure, and fear creates distance too, a different kind, but the effect is the same. And so he moves through his world surrounded by people and almost completely alone, which is a strange thing to be when you can destroy a planet with a punch, and you spend most of your time worrying about whether your grocery store has a sale on crab this week. Diana listens to all of this and she nods slowly, and she says that she understands more of that than he might expect, and she is not performing empathy. She is not deploying it strategically the way Batman might deploy honesty, as a tool to open a door she wants to walk through. She means it, and Saitama can tell the difference, and something in him settles slightly, the way a room settles when a sound you have been hearing for so long you stopped noticing it finally stops. She tells him she wants to spar with him, not to assess him, not to test his limits, not for any of the reasons the rest of the League has been poking at him since he arrived, but because she thinks they are both people who understand something about fighting that goes beyond the mechanical exchange of force, and she thinks that understanding deserves to meet itself, and she wants to see what that looks like. Saitama looks at her for a long moment, and then something happens to his face that has not happened since he arrived in this universe, something small and genuine and significant, and he says okay, yeah, he would like that, and he gets up off the floor and there is something in the way he moves when he says it, something with just a little more energy in it than anything he has shown so far, that makes Diana's warrior instincts quietly and immediately sharpen. She moves first, and she moves fast, faster than she commits to in most fights because she respects what she is standing across from, and respect in Diana's vocabulary has always meant bringing your actual self to the encounter rather than a carefully measured portion of it. She comes in low with her bracers raised, and she hits him with a combination that has dropped gods before, a sequence she developed over decades of fighting things that should not have been fightable, and Saitama rolls with it, which is not what she expected. She expected him to stand still and let it happen the way he stood still for Superman's punch. But instead he moves, actually moves with something that is almost technique. Almost the ghost of someone who once trained seriously and never entirely forgot what that felt like. And the engagement that follows is not what anyone watching from the observation booth expected, which is why all of them are now at the observation booth, because Cyborg picked up the energy readings from the corridor and put it on the main screen, and nobody could quite make themselves look away. It is not a clash of titanic forces reducing the room to rubble. It is something stranger and more interesting than that, something that looks almost like a conversation conducted in movement, Diana pressing forward with everything she has in a series of engagements that each last only seconds before Saitama adjusts and shifts and responds, not with his full output, not with anything close to it, but with just enough, precisely enough, the exact amount required to meet each of her strikes without ending the exchange. And the precision of that calibration is itself an extraordinary thing to watch, because it means he is not just strong. He is in control of his strength at a level of granularity that none of them had fully appreciated until this moment. That the man who put 2 fingers through a Prometheum wall at 3% can also choose, in real time, to absorb the strike of an Amazonian warrior goddess, without letting it become a demolition event. Can hold the space between his power and hers open long enough for something that actually feels like a fight to happen inside it. Diana feels this too. She can feel the calibration in every exchange, can feel the way he is meeting her and not exceeding her, and she knows what that means, has known since she first sat down across from him, but feeling it in her body is different from knowing it in her head, and what it feels like is not defeat, or not only defeat, but something more complex. The feeling of being genuinely seen by something vast enough that seeing you requires it to look down, and choosing not to make that smallness the point. She pushes harder, drives her full strength into a strike that she would describe later, honestly and without false modesty, as the hardest single strike she has thrown in this decade, and Saitama catches it with an open palm and holds it there. And they are still for a moment, her fist in his palm, and he is looking at her with an expression that is no longer bored, no longer the distant mild attention he has been giving everything since he arrived, but something genuinely present, genuinely engaged. The expression of someone who has found something worth looking at. He says she is really good. He says it simply and directly, and it is clearly the truest thing he has said since he got here. And Diana looks at him and says she knows. And she asks him if this is the most fun he has had since he lost his ability to feel challenged. And Saitama thinks about that honestly for a moment and says it is close. It is really close, and something in his voice when he says it carries the whole weight of what he told her earlier. The distance and the loneliness and the specific grief of a man who became too strong to touch the thing he loves most about being alive. And Diana hears all of it. She steps back and she uncurls her fist, and she says she wants to ask him something, and he nods. And she asks him if he has ever considered that the problem is not the strength, that the problem is that he has been looking for the challenge in the wrong place, that he has been measuring himself against opponents when maybe what he is actually missing is not an opponent at all but a reason, something worth protecting, something that the strength is for rather than something the strength is against. And Saitama goes very quiet. In the observation booth, Superman is watching this, and his expression is doing something complicated, something that involves the certainty he broke 2 hours ago and the question of what you build in its place, and he is quiet too. Batman is watching Saitama's face on the monitor, and he is reading it the way he reads everything, carefully and with full attention. And what he reads there is not the boredom, not the mild absent patience that has been Saitama's default since Centennial Park, but something raw and unresolved and real, the face of someone who has been handed a question that has no tactical solution, only a human one, and does not yet know what to do with it. Hal Jordan says quietly that he did not expect the afternoon to go like this, and nobody responds, because there is nothing to add to that. It is simply true. None of them expected any of this. None of them had a framework for a man who could break every measure of power they possessed and be brought to stillness not by a stronger punch, but by a question asked by someone sitting on the floor across from him who decided that understanding mattered more than winning. Saitama looks at Diana for a long time in the quiet of the training facility, and he says he has never thought about it that way. And Diana says she knows. And she says she thinks that might be the most important thing anyone has told him in a very long time. And Saitama nods slowly, just once, and looks back out through the observation window at the earth turning below them. And the expression on his face is not boredom, and it is not the mild, distant politeness of a man waiting for something that never comes. It is something quieter and more serious and altogether more human than anything they have seen from him since he arrived. And it stays there, on his face and in the room, long after the conversation has ended, and the silence has settled around them like the particular silence that comes after something true has been said, and there is nothing left to do but let it be true. He leaves on a Thursday. This detail matters for no strategic reason and no narrative reason, and no reason that Batman would ever include in an official report. But it is the detail that Barry Allen remembers most clearly afterward, that it was a Thursday, an ordinary midweek day with nothing particular attached to it. Gray clouds over the eastern seaboard, and a low-pressure system moving up from the Gulf, and the Daily Planet running a story about a city council budget dispute on page 4. And somewhere in the middle of all that ordinary Thursday texture, the dimensional rift that had been building in the lower atmosphere since Cyborg first detected its energy signature 48 hours earlier finally stabilized into something traversable. And Saitama stood in Centennial Park again, in the same crater he had made arriving, and looked at the tear in the air in front of him with the same mild, unhurried attention he had given everything else since he got here. And the Justice League stood around him in a loose arc that nobody had formally arranged, but that everyone had somehow arrived at naturally, the way people arrange themselves around something that is ending when they are not quite ready for it to end. He does not make a speech. This is consistent with everything they have learned about him, that Saitama does not perform his feelings, does not dress them up in language designed to land a particular way, does not manage the impression he leaves because managing impressions requires caring what the impression is. And Saitama has spent enough time around the Justice League now to have stopped performing anything for them, to simply be what he is in the room, which turns out to be something considerably more than the sensor readings ever captured, and considerably less than the threat assessment models suggested. He looks at the rift, and he looks back at all of them, and he says it was nice to meet you guys, genuinely. And he means it in the simple, direct way he means everything, without subtext, without strategy, without the weight of everything that has happened in the last 72 hours pressing the words into a shape they were not originally intended to have. Superman steps forward. He has been thinking about what he wants to say since yesterday evening, turning it over in his head the way he turns difficult things over, carefully, and with full attention, wanting to get it right not because getting it right matters for any external reason, but because he is Clark Kent and Clark Kent takes the things he says to people seriously, believes that words between people who have genuinely encountered each other carry weight that deserves to be handled carefully. He tells Saitama that he wants him to know that the last 3 days have changed something for him, not in a way he can fully articulate yet, not in a way that has resolved into clean language, but something fundamental about how he understands his own strength and what it is for and what it costs. And he says thank you, which is not a thing Superman says without meaning it, and Saitama looks at him and nods and says he gets it, and there is something between them in that moment. something that passes between two people who have touched the same truth from different sides, that does not require any more words than that. Diana says nothing because she and Saitama said what needed to be said yesterday in the training facility and they both know it. But she holds his gaze for a moment, and something moves between them that functions as a goodbye without needing to wear that shape. And Saitama gives her a small nod that carries more acknowledgement in it than most people pack into entire conversations. Bari shakes his hand, which involves Bari almost vibrating out of his own skin, trying to decide how much of his actual speed to suppress during the handshake. And he tells Saitama that he has never in his life met anyone whose reflexes he could not get ahead of, and that this information has shaken him on a fundamental level. And he has not yet decided if that is a good thing or a bad thing, but he is leaning toward good. And Saitama tells him he is very fast, and Bari says yes he is, and they share the particular smile of two people who are both somewhat defined by a quality that makes them hard to reach, and have just briefly, unexpectedly reached each other. Hal Jordan tells him that if he ever figures out how to get back, he owes them a rematch, and Saitama says sure. And Hal says he means a real one this time, and Saitama looks at him with that mild expression and says he knows. And Hal decides not to push that thread any further, because the implication of what a real one would look like has been sitting in the back of his mind since the sensor readout during the yawn, and it is not a comfortable place to look directly. Aquaman shakes his hand with the particular formal gravity of a king, acknowledging someone whose power he has measured and found impossible to categorize within any existing hierarchy, which is the closest Arthur Curry gets to being flustered by anything. Cyborg runs one last scan, gets the same impossible data he has been getting for 3 days, adds it to a file he is going to be analyzing for the next 6 months, and says quietly that it was an honor, and he means it in the specific way engineers mean it when they have encountered something that broke their models and taught them where the edges of their understanding actually are. Batman says nothing until the very end, until everyone else has said their piece and the rift is visibly widening, the air around it beginning to distort with the particular shimmer of dimensional instability. And then he steps forward, and he stands beside Saitama, and he looks at the rift rather than at Saitama, and he says that he wants him to know that he updated his contingency files. And Saitama looks at him and says, "What does that mean?" And Batman says it means that there is now a file in his system with Saitama's name on it, and the file does not contain threat assessment models or neutralization protocols or any of the things his files usually contain. It contains 3 words, and the 3 words are "leave him alone." And he says he thought Saitama would want to know that someone in this universe had a plan that took him seriously, even if the plan was just to be sensible about it. Saitama looks at him for a moment, and then he says that is the nicest thing anyone has ever put in a file about him. And Batman says he imagines that is probably true, and it is the closest Bruce Wayne comes to a joke in a context where he actually means it. And Saitama almost smiles again, that same small almost smile from the training facility, and then he turns back to the rift and steps through it and is gone. The park is quiet. The rift closes behind him with a sound like a very large book being shut, a soft concussive thump that stirs the leaves in the surrounding trees and sends the pigeons wheeling upward again, the same pigeons that scattered when he arrived, or possibly their descendants, pigeons being difficult to distinguish from one another, and Thursday being the kind of day where you do not have the energy to investigate that question very deeply. The crater is still there. Nobody has filled it in, partly because the city's maintenance department has been somewhat overwhelmed by the general state of Centennial Park since Tuesday, and partly because there was a quiet, unspoken agreement among the people who were standing in it that the crater should stay for a while, that removing it immediately would be a kind of erasure that none of them were ready for yet. Superman flies back to Metropolis, and he spends the afternoon walking, which he does sometimes when he needs to think without the altitude giving him perspective he has not earned yet, just walking the streets of the city he has sworn to protect, watching people go about the ordinary business of their Thursday, and he thinks about what Saitama told him without telling him. The thing that Diana named in the training facility, but that Clark Kent has to arrive at himself in his own language. Which is that the strength is not the point, that the strength has never been the point, that what makes the difference between a man with power and Superman is not the scale of what he can do, but the weight of what he is doing it for. And that weight, that why, is the thing that Saitama lost somewhere in the training that made him unstoppable, the thing he punched out of himself along with every limit, and the thing that Clark Kent has been quietly, unconsciously taking for granted since the day he understood what he was capable of. He thinks about this for a long time, walking the streets of Metropolis on a gray Thursday afternoon, and then he does something he has not done in a while, not for any crisis or emergency or world-ending event, but just because it is Thursday and someone probably needs it somewhere. He helps a woman carry her groceries to her car in the parking lot of a supermarket on 5th, and she thanks him and he says it is no problem, and the smile he gives her is the same one he has been giving people since Smallville, and it is absolutely genuine, and that genuineness is the whole thing. That is everything, and he knows it in a way he did not quite know it 3 days ago. Diana writes. She keeps journals, has kept them for decades, long handwritten records of the things she has seen and fought and learned and lost, and she sits in her apartment in the city, and she writes about Saitama for a long time, not about the fight, not about the power readings or the sensor data or the breach in the Watchtower hull, but about the conversation on the floor of the training facility and the specific quality of loneliness she recognized in him. The loneliness of someone who has become so singular that the ordinary bridges between people no longer reach, and she writes about what it means to be beyond measure in a world that needs you to be measurable, what it costs to be the strongest thing in every room when what you actually want is for the room to be able to push back. And she writes that she thinks Saitama is not a cautionary tale, that the easy reading of him is the wrong one, that he is not a warning about power or ambition or the price of strength, but something more specific and more human than that. A story about what happens when you are so focused on becoming capable of protecting the things you love that you forget to stay in contact with the loving itself. And when she finishes writing, she closes the journal and sits for a while in the quiet of her apartment, and thinks that there is probably a lesson in there for everyone in this line of work, herself very much included. Batman adds to the file. He does not add threat assessments or contingency protocols or any of the things he would normally add to a file about an entity of this magnitude. He adds observations, careful and precise and uncharacteristically personal, notes about the quality of attention Saitama brought to the conversations that actually mattered, about the way he caught Superman's punch without any discernible change in his resting expression, about the yawn and what the sensors read during it, about the paper crane that he left behind on the floor of the training facility, which Cyborg picked up and which is currently sitting on a shelf in the Watchtower's main corridor in a small glass case, because nobody could quite bring themselves to throw it away. He adds a note at the very end of the file, separate from the observations, just a single line that he writes and then looks at for a long time before deciding to leave it in. And the line says that in 30 years of doing this job, he has encountered 3 things that he genuinely could not plan around, and that Saitama is the only one of the 3 that he did not need to. And somewhere in another universe, in a city that has its own particular relationship with disaster and its own stubborn refusal to give in to it, a man in a yellow jumpsuit stands in the supermarket aisle looking at the sale sign above the crab and doing the math on whether it is worth it at this price, which it is not. It is really not. The markup on these things is genuinely unreasonable, and he sighs and puts it back and reaches for something more affordable. And the fluorescent lights hum above him, and the other shoppers move around him without looking twice because he looks like exactly what he is, which is a man doing his shopping on a Thursday, nobody special, nobody remarkable, just a person in the world trying to figure out what to have for dinner. And the ordinariness of it is both the loneliest thing in any universe, and, if you know where to look, which Diana does, which Batman does, which Clark Kent walking the streets of Metropolis on a gray afternoon is beginning to, the most quietly extraordinary thing you have ever seen. Because the man who could end worlds in a single punch chose the crab that was on sale last week, and the fact that this week it is not on sale is a genuine disappointment to him, and the gap between those two things, between what he is and what he cares about, between the scale of his power and the scale of his Tuesday, is not a tragedy and it is not a joke. It is just Saitama, and Saitama is, in the end, the most human thing the Justice League ever encountered, which is the thing none of them saw coming, and the thing all of them will carry for a very long time after a Thursday in Centennial Park when something fell from the sky and turned out not to be a threat at all, but a question, the oldest and most important question, the one that every person with any kind of power eventually has to answer, about what the strength is for, and whether the answer you have is the right one, and whether you are brave enough to look at it honestly when someone sits down across from you on the floor and asks,